This is Blood 2: The Chosen, created by Monolith Productions, published by GT Interactive, and released in 1998. Unlike its predecessor, which uses Ken Silverman's build engine, Blood 2 uses the first iteration of the Lithtech engine. The game takes place in 2028, 100 years after the end of the original game. The Cabal has grown since then. They founded and developed a multi-billion-dollar corporation with ties to every major global market to act as a front for their operations. Through this corporation, they conduct research and recruit new members to grow their power and influence on the world. Gideon, the leader of the cult, is out to destroy Caleb, and this is how the game starts. Like its predecessor, Blood 2 exaggerates the amount of blood and gore in the game. Small pokes and prods with the smaller weapons will yield a good amount of blood splatter, but the big guns will leave you with some nice, juicy parts on the ground. The game has 17 weapons you can play with, but you only have 10 slots to hold them in, equipped using the numbers 1 through 0. You'll eventually be dropping some of these weapons to replace them with shiny new ones. Some of the previous weapons are making their return here, like the flare gun and the voodoo doll. Some new ones are the modern weapons like the M16s and the 50 caliber sniper rifle, as well as some heavy hitters like the howitzer and the minigun. But some of them just feel gimmicky and serve no real purpose, like the bug spray canister. You'll mainly be sticking to a handful of core weapons like the sawed-off and the M16 since they have the most utility and there's an abundance of ammo for them everywhere you go. Many of the weapons, both big and small, are carried by the more common enemies. These would be the cultists who ditch their robes for business attire, and the fanatics who are decked out in full combat gear. But there's still a diverse set of enemies to fill up the levels. The zealots are the ones who have mastered the dark arts. They're able to maneuver and attack with powerful magic, and are usually supported by the lesser Cabal members. Soul drudges are essentially the zombies of the game. They're easy to deal with. The Drudge Lords hurl fireballs that take off massive amounts of health, but they don't seem to work well together. I just pit them against one another to make things easier for me. The Shikari are basically agile predators. I have no idea how they fit into the Blood universe, but they're here and they're a pain in the ass. Combine these with the familiar face-grabbing enemies like the Choking Hands, and you have a roster of enemies that are interesting, to say the least. The combat itself is frustrating, especially when you consider the fact that the 3 difficulty modes do not scale very well. The number of enemies you encounter does not change, but their health and damage do. This means you can run and gun on the easier modes and everything just explodes. But on the hardest difficulty, you have to go slow. It's useless to take cover around a corner or behind some boxes because the enemies are obscenely accurate. I lost count how many times I died from someone with a pistol. Every shot that hits you barely does any damage, but these numbers add up. They wear you down. A single shot can potentially take them out, but sometimes it takes 50. Supposedly, headshots do count for something, but it seems like the amount of damage is randomly generated more than anything else. It's difficult to properly gauge an encounter beforehand, so you just have to run in, take them on one at a time, and hope they die in a timely fashion. Many of the later enemies start to become bullet sponges. This doesn't add to the difficulty or the challenge, it just takes longer to kill. Tone the difficulty down, they go down quick. Another thing that pisses me off are the corners of the walls. Yeah, I'm complaining about the corners. It's bad enough that I can't use them for cover. These things are also blocking my own shots. Look at the bullet holes floating in midair. When I'm trying to snipe them from a distance, the shots you should be able to make end up being stopped dead in its tracks. You can dual wield some weapons like in the original, but you acquire 2 of the same weapon instead of a temporary power-up. It's a good system in theory, but it's poorly implemented. When you're dual wielding weapons, you lose their alternate fire mode. Sure, you can simply drop one of them to regain that ability, but it's such a hassle every time you run across another one. You can't equip only one of them. There's quite a few features in the game that are frustrating to no end, but there's still a handful of good things I can say about this game. The story is told through a number of cutscenes. The dialogue between Caleb and the Chosen do fit nicely in conveying the story, and he sounds as sinister as ever, but the references to popular culture were toned down for this game. You still come across them every now and then, but there's not a whole lot.
Why can't I find Amanda Hugginkiss? Can you help me find Amanda Hugginkiss?
I find that the sound of the weapons relates to their usefulness. The sawed-off is loud and powerful, but the bug spray simply squeaks. The music in the game is amazing. It has that darker, gothic feel to it that goes really well with the theme. The problem here is that there's not a whole lot of it, just a handful of tracks to keep you pumped up for the action, but the music the game does have is very good. The textures and the 3D models are workable, but I feel the limitations here are more about the engine than artistic talent. The levels can look bland at times, the textures are okay, the areas look plain yet functional, but the graphics in general hasn't aged well over the years. They threw in some things to dress them up wherever they could, but there are many flaws in the overall level design. The traditional level design philosophy was all about finding keys and pushing buttons to progress. This was getting stale by the late 90s, and Blood 2 continued to use it. The design team was consciously aware of this. One of the objectives even tells you to push some buttons and kill some things. It shows that they have a sense of humor, but making jokes about it doesn't really help. On top of that, you'll often go back to levels you've already been through, except it's not the same level. It just has the same architecture. You'll explore the place again until you find a new path that opened up since your last visit. One could argue that it's no different than games like Quake 2, where you could go back and forth between levels. You're going through the same areas multiple times, right? Well, I say it's different because you can't go back and grab something you forgot from a previous level. It's more of an illusion than a robust feature, and it feels like you're playing filler content when you go through the same area the third time around. Part of the fun you had with the original game was sending your enemies flying across the level with explosions. Blood 2 removed this altogether. The weapons barely have any sort of knockback effect. The flares and the other fire weapons aren't as exciting either. After being burnt to a crisp, they simply die. Compare that to the original game, where a guy on fire is running towards you before eventually dying off. These are things that made it stand out from the crowd, all of which are missing in the sequel. So, what the hell happened? With the release of Half-Life on the horizon, as well as other competing games like Sin, Thief, and Unreal, GT Interactive saw the need to push the game out the door. Because of the relatively small fan base for Blood, this became a matter of dollars versus quality. Blood 2 was released with multiple bugs, half-finished features, and problems with multiplayer. Some of them were fixed through multiple patches, but there are still many problems with the game. It's sad to see such great potential for a game go to waste, and the game itself had a remarkable start in its development. Jason Hall, the CEO of Monolith Productions, was active on the official Blood 2 forums. He was receiving feedback from the community on screenshots and sound files, and even based the design direction of the game on a forum poll. Do you want to play solely as Caleb and have a deeper story around him? Or do you want to play as all of the Chosen and have some story for each of them? The former was chosen by the community, but the ability to play as the Chosen was still implemented, minus the cutscenes and the story. When it came to the demo's release, you may have not realized all the problems I've mentioned before. The demo only had 2 levels, the Center for Disease Management and the elevator going towards the airship, so in a sense, it's 1.5 levels. You had access to the pistols, MAC-10s, the M16, and the Tesla cannon. You got a good look at the game, but there wasn't enough content to properly determine how the game plays out. I had no interest in the full version after playing this demo. For those who did purchase the game, an expansion pack was released a year later called The Nightmare Levels. This has the player relive some of the memories of the Chosen. Caleb's memory is that of the original game's Episode 2, and this brings back the robed cultists. If you played the original game, you'll be quick to notice how little effort was put into this expansion. I was expecting to use Caleb's 1928 arsenal, a Tommy gun, some dynamite, but instead we have the stock Blood 2 weapons. And it's very short as well, you can play through this in about an hour. Long story short, Blood 2 is lacking many of the things that made the original great in the first place. The gameplay was functional, but there's a lot of room for improvement. The music is amazing, and it's probably the best part of this game. It's hard to find anything good to say. The game does have some good qualities to it, but they're few and far between. The bad qualities are front and center, and you can just feel them when you're playing. Many of its shortcomings can be attributed to its rushed development. The fact that Blood 2 was released a mere month after Shogo should set off some red flags. The blueprints are solid, but the construction was shoddy. Given enough time, I think Blood 2 would have been an amazing game. But as it is, the game is flawed in its execution and presentation, as well as its post-release support. You won't be missing much if you skip this game, but if you decide to play it, maybe you'll enjoy it, maybe not. If you need to quell your blood cravings, the original game is as good as it gets. Perhaps we'll see a vast improvement in Blood 3, except this will never happen. The trademark to the Blood franchise was cancelled in 2009, so Monolith is showing they no longer have any interest in the Blood franchise. Perhaps we'll see a spiritual sequel, but unless the average gamer can be hyped up for one, Caleb will finally be able to rest in peace.